Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 28th March 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, by Robinson, Brian Gerrish. We're joined by Alex Thomson with Eastern Approaches, and of course Alex reporting from the Netherlands. UK Column News today we think is the most serious, the most important edition we have ever put out, and we'll get straight into it.
Fusion doctrine has been unleashed, Brian. What can we say about this?
Astonishing. People should be extremely concerned. This is the dictatorship unfolding, Mike.
The dictatorship unfolding. Well, let's just have a look at how the dictatorship has been unfolding. It began on the 25th of September 2014, and David Cameron speaking to the United Nations General Assembly. Let's have a brief listen to what he had to say.
To defeat ISIL and organisations like it, we must defeat this ideology in all its forms. As evidence emerges about the backgrounds of those convicted of terrorist offences, it is clear that many of them were initially influenced by preachers who claim not to encourage violence, but whose worldview can be used as a justification for it. We know this worldview, the peddling of lies, that 9/11 was somehow a Jewish plot, or that the 7/7 London attacks were staged. The idea that Muslims are persecuted all over the world as a deliberate act of Western policy. The concept of an inevitable clash of civilizations. We must be clear, to defeat the ideology of extremism, we need to deal with all forms of extremism, not just violent extremism. Of course, some will argue that this is not compatible with free speech and intellectual inquiry. But I ask you, would we sit back and allow right-wing extremists, Nazis or Ku Klux Klansmen to recruit on our university campuses? No. So we shouldn't stand by and just allow any form of non-violent extremism. We need to argue that prophecies of a global war of religion, pitting Muslims against the rest of the world, these things are nonsense.
So these things are nonsense, Brian, except that in the Telegraph article that we showed at the first slide there, sources warned that Islamic terror threat is likely to rise in the next 2 years, as Mrs May revealed a major new effort to ensure every government agency and department views national security as their priority. So they're absolutely promoting the idea that we're heading towards a war with the Muslim community.
Yeah.
And this is being pushed by many people, including UKIP these days.
Absolutely driven through every media outlet possible. And there's a forecast here. They're saying that the threat is going to increase. How do they know that? Well, because it's become very, very obvious that the UK government is helping to fund at least some of the agents who are behind the Islamic extremists. But what have we got as a response, Mike? We've got the state now fully embedding British intelligence and the security services everywhere. They're going to be watching every part of society.
Absolutely. So the David Cameron speech started this process off. We moved forward a couple of years to the 6th of November 2016, and we saw the first instance of the term fake news appearing in the mainstream media. This is where it began with BuzzFeed News, how teens in the Balkans are duping Trump supporters with fake news. That was followed up on the 15th of November 2016 with post-truth becoming the word of the year, according to Oxford dictionaries. On the 8th of December 2016, we had Hillary Clinton saying that this epidemic of malicious fake news and false propaganda that flooded social media over the past year, it's now clear that so-called fake news can have real-world consequences. So we move forward to the 13th of June 2017, and Treason May saying, but nowhere is our cooperation closer than the areas of defence and security, with British and French fighter pilots fighting alongside one another and in each other's planes over Syria and Iraq. As I've said before, in the UK, we're already working with social media companies to halt the spread of extremist material and poisonous propaganda that is warping young minds, but we know they need to do more. And today we can announce that the UK and France will work together to encourage corporations to do more and abide by their social responsibility to step up their efforts to remove harmful content from their networks. So as the pressure started to build and the concern over fake news started to build, Treason May teaming up with others to push forward this policy which Cameron started at the United Nations a few years before. We're launching, she said, a joint UK-French campaign to ensure that the internet cannot be used as a safe place for terrorists and criminals, and it cannot be used to host the radicalizing material that leads to so much harm. Crucially, our campaign will also include exploring creating a legal liability for tech companies if they fail to take necessary action to remove unacceptable content. And she went on to say, we're united in our total condemnation of terrorism and our commitment to stamp out this evil. Then on the 4th of June 2017, Theresa May was saying that enough was enough. This was following the London terror attacks. So she pledged, according to City AM here, to step up the fight against terrorism. She said enough was enough, that difficult conversations were needed to weed out potential terrorists from UK communities, adding that Britain has been far too tolerant of extremism. And we've got this constant, in this whole process, Brian, we've got this constant conflation between Islamic terrorism and extremism. And of course, when they talk about extremism, they're talking about extremism in its broadest terms, its broadest meaning, not just Islamic extremism. The article here says that earlier in the day, May spoke outside number 10 Downing Street in the wake of Saturday night's attack in London Bridge and Borough Market, in which 7 people were killed and 48 injured. The incident follows a suicide bomb which killed more than 20 people in Manchester. And during her speech, Theresa May said, we cannot allow this ideology the safe space it needs to breed. Yet that's exactly what the internet and the big companies that provide internet-based services provide. And she called for international agreements to regulate cyberspace. She said we need to do everything we can at home to reduce the risks of extremism online, and so it goes on. And what followed then was a number of meetings in number 10 Downing Street where she called in the big tech companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, all attended. There were 2 or 3 meetings in the coming days and weeks, culminating on the 26th of June with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And this is the press release from Twitter on this. It says, today Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter and YouTube are announcing the formation of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, and which will help us continue to make our hosted consumer services hostile to terrorists and violent extremists. The spread of terrorism and violent extremism is a pressing global problem and a critical challenge for us all. We take these issues very seriously, and each of our companies have developed policies and removal practices that enable us to take a hard line against terrorist or violent extremist views on our hosted consumer services. And the point is, and what's absolutely clear is, since that took place in June last year, 26th of June last year, we haven't seen violent extremist content coming off these platforms. Instead, what we've seen is alternative media coming off these platforms.
It's spread sideways.
Okay, so then we move on to the 20th of September last year. Theresa May, this time at the UN General Assembly, saying industry needs to go further and faster in automating the detection and removal of terrorist content online and developing technological solutions which prevent it being uploaded in the first place. So that's what she was up to at that point. She also said that they can do more to spread the evil of the material by groups such as Daesh. So under the smokescreen of ISIS and Daesh, she's pushing this agenda. She said internet companies are already making progress towards automatic identification of terrorist content. Google and YouTube have announced that they are increasing their use of technology to help automatically identify videos. And so she went on. Then on the following day, she was proudly announcing that they had used the full weight of their diplomacy to ensure that they've not had to ensure that she and the French and others are preventing terrorist use of the internet, as you can see on screen there. And then this brings us up more or less to date, because in the last few months we've seen the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee running a fake news inquiry, and yesterday on the 27th of March they had the latest edition of the fake news inquiry, where they had Mr. Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, giving evidence. And of course, the Cambridge Analytica story, aside from how it's now being used to target the Brexit campaign and so on, but the main focus of the early part of this effort in the press has been to target Facebook, because Facebook and the others are not moving forward with this quickly enough. And then today we have this announcement, 28th of March 2018, of the Fusion Doctrine. And it is a spectacular piece of work here. I'll just take some quotes from that original Telegraph article that Brian showed at the beginning there. The Prime Minister has instructed the intelligence services to use social media to disrupt misinformation, as she promised to use every capability at her disposal to defeat the new threat facing Britain. The new threat facing Britain seems to be a combination of the Russian threat and the so-called fake news disinformation agenda, as well as increased Russian aggression. The Telegraph article says sources warned that the Islamist terror threat is likely to rise in the next 2 years, as Mrs. May unveiled a major new effort to ensure every government agency and department views national security as their priority, rather than just police and security services. Security sources told the Telegraph that the threat from nations like Russia and North Korea can no longer be tackled by a traditional response from the military or security services, and that every department, including the Environment Agency and HMRC, must play a role. The UK must also employ soft power and counter-propaganda on social media, including by suffocating hashtags on Twitter to prevent ISIL from getting its message out and disseminating alternative narratives online, boosting the role of the BBC's World Service to promote British values abroad, ensuring Ofcom shuts down media organisations which do not meet high British standards, and funding units to counter fake news are all part of the plan, sources said. Communications will play an integral role in the new mission, the report states, and countering misinformation will be an important weapon in the armoury. This has got to be the most dictatorial steps that we have seen to date.
Yeah. It's fascism. I think this is absolutely clear now. What you can see is that it may be hidden in the coattails that it's the Conservative Party, but this is raw fascism. If you wanted to go slightly off that, you could say we're looking at something which is communitarian, but this is a dictatorship. It's breaking surface. This is about a massive, massive clampdown on free speech. I mean, what a phrase, suffocating hashtags, not dealing with them, suffocating them. And this is what they are really doing to free speech. And of course, any and every dictatorship always wants to control free speech in order to run its political agenda.
Let's bring Alex Thomson into the programme at this point. Alex, what are your thoughts on that as we've run through it there?
It's extremely worrying, Mike. Perhaps with a selfish perspective, I'm wondering whether this is the time when they will come for UK column. They've always resisted till now, except the sideways approach through @VOD. And our own analysis is that it was more trouble than it was worth to go for us, because we are careful in what we say and it's sourced, and perhaps it would cause more attention to be brought to our material if we were got at. But with this strategic cabinet level policy in post, I think it's quite possible that they will try to take us off air now. We shall have to see. But a critical mass of people, I think, has already woken up to this agenda, particularly the Middle England types, the middle-aged, the middle class, who are so important, the sentiment that they have, because that really controls the sentiment of the nation. I think that has already flipped. I think that this is a leg of what Brian has called the new Operation Barbarossa strategy, which is at least keeping tensions along the EU's eastern border and creating a sealed information space within that EU zone, which, as we know, is really Britain and America steering the continent. The latest person to say that in an interview on RT, probably RT is going to be banned itself soon, was the Virginia State Senator Richard Black, who said that when Britain and America have an agenda, Europe swings into line with it. Well, of course, that's what the EU was set up for. for Britain and America, and more particularly Wall Street and the city and the armaments companies and the propagandists to control the continent and make them think that these ideas are their own continental ideas. One further thing I'll say on that is that Catherine Connolly, Catherine with a C, she's an independent TD, a member of the Irish Dáil, the parliament there for Galway West, gave a rip-roaring speech people can easily find on social media, in which she said it is sickening that Ireland, with its neutrality constitutionally, is being pulled into this as well. Members of the European Parliament for Fine Gael, which is basically a Sorosite party these days, have written a document saying Ireland isn't really neutral after all. We need to revise what that means and get on board with the anti-Russian agenda. So the whole of the British Isles are being sewn in together with the EU into this informational strategy, a total strategy which is aimed at warfare. And it goes back before the Conservative Liberal Democrat joint administration of 2010 to 2015, Mike, because I remember in 2007, give or take 1 year, that one of these social climbing type guys at GCHQ excitedly told a bunch of us that there was a new policy called shaping, and it was not yet legal, but GCHQ was doing it anyway, and that developed into JTRIG, which is the heart of the massaging of Twitter hashtags and YouTube viewing figures and sock puppets on social media. So this agenda clearly is deep state and not a party agenda, because we've had it through Labour, Lib Dem and Tory administrations now, and the Scottish National Party is on board with it. So what further proof could you have that it is not a party agenda?
Okay, well, that raises an interesting question, because how much of this have they been doing already, do you think? We've been talking, or we've been suggesting for quite a long time, that we're living in what is tantamount to a dictatorship. Is this are they moving this a step forward, or are they trying to bring what they've been doing for the last 10 years up to date and legalize it effectively?
I think the latter, Mike. The security services have a habit in technological capabilities of first doing it and then legalizing it retrospectively. There's a pattern of that which has been established, and the Brits more particularly so than the Americans or the Commonwealth nations in the Five Eyes, because the US and the Commonwealth nations in the Five Eyes tend to have stricter parliamentarians and constitutional enforcement than we do. We have the Maxwell Fyfe Doctrine, the name of the double-barreled director of MI5 from 1953, who told ministers, you will not involve yourself in the work of the security services, and that doctrine stands. That's one of the reasons, I think, why the security services have got away with so much. So I think the latter, this has been test-bedded for a decade, as with so many totalitarian agendas coming out of the British psychological and security deep state. The population has been decades behind in its willingness, and with a bit of stoking, or a lot of stoking now, I think the population is being brought to a point of readiness or weary acceptance of rollout of a technology which is already a decade old.
Okay, so if that's what the security services have been up to, what about the talk about every government department being involved in this? Because that certainly hasn't been the case up until now.
No, but there are indications of what this means. I think it means spooks going into the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Authority in Swansea, into the Department of Social Security, or whatever they're called this week, and the housing people and the benefits agencies, and saying, you are going to make this particular person's life hell because he is an anti-state agent. Dissident. It's a tried and tested technique, and I think there's been intimations of HMRC, Revenue and Customs, already having done this. If you look at the case of Michelle Young, the widow of Scott Young, Scott with one T, who was gruesomely murdered in 2013 or 14, I believe it was, because of being tied up with the Russian oligarchs issue, which is a phenomenally complex one with double and triple crossing. But the point is, Michelle Young wrote to the government in 2013, before her husband was murdered, saying Revenue and Customs have been colluding with an attempt to show my estranged husband as penniless, and have not been responding to my concerns. And she later found out that MI6 men, using false names by their own admission, were involved in that customs operation or suppression. And it's not the first time I've heard of such things. So I think it involves denying housing, credit and social presence, really, validity of life to anyone who is found to be a dissident.
Yeah. As you're talking through that, Alex, what just comes into my mind is the Stasi state, the East German state, particularly brutal. But of course, one of the key attributes of that state was that people spied on each other. People within families were spying on family members for the state. They were spying on neighbours, friends, colleagues, other people. And this is exactly the model that's now been brought in. We know from reports across the country how concerned they are that the government's prevent teams are particularly going into schools and encouraging the school and children to be spying and reporting on other people. This is very, very dirty, dark and dangerous stuff. This is Stasi type model, and we're just seeing it rolled out quite casually in 2018. I don't know whether you would agree with that, but it doesn't quite fit the Soviet model, but the Stasi model, I think it does.
Clearly, it's much closer, Brian, to the Stasi model, the use of inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, or IMs, which is the mass of the population that was compromised or brainwashed enough to tell the state what it needed to know without the state having to use its own assets to find out. And of course, via Sweden in particular, which was neutral, supposedly still is, this model was leaked into Western Europe. It's much more a European style because populations differ in how they will accept and tolerate things. And the East German model is much more geared towards the mentality that's also found in Britain of, I have nothing to hide and keeping to myself and getting one up on the Joneses. It's very much the case. And Prevent was also a 2007-ish issue. It came out of the same stable and was suddenly announced from on high from the corridors of Queen Anne's Gate, the Home Office, at the same time as these shaping or manipulation techniques, which were then unlawful. So I do think that the same few brains have been behind this for a decade. These plans take a long while to roll out.
Yeah.
Alex, it's a bit difficult not to draw comparisons with the Reichstag fire or that period of history. So just take us through this.
For those who don't know, there was a mysterious fire set by a brainwashed Dutch communist who was executed. At least he was the scapegoat. And in a moment, we'll see Hitler's speech in response. But it was a pretext for the government to do away with parliamentary and particularly constitutional government. So this is the latter page of the Ermächtigungsgesetz, the Enabling Act of 1933. You can see von Hindenburg, the nominal head of state, the president, with his big pasty signature, and underneath the crabbed signature of Reichskanzler Adolf Hitler. And behind that, the other signatures, the interior and foreign ministers and finance ministers. And this is the enabling law. It's only 5 articles long. I've stripped out the German specific titles so that British, US, Commonwealth viewers can understand more generically what's going on here. And I have to say that the US is actually closest in following this heretofore because they already have executive orders and have had for decades. That's how the intelligence agencies have ruled. But look here, Article 1 says national statutes may, in addition to via constitutional means, also be issued by executive order. Article 2, laws enacted by the executive are allowed to be unconstitutional as long as they do not affect parliamentary bodies. My comment, this is the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, and as long as you keep that supposed doctrine intact, you've got the MPs suite and they won't rebel. And Article 2 ends, presidential prerogative remains unaffected. That, of course, is the royal prerogative in the British system or Commonwealth. Article 3, statutes enacted by executive order shall be issued by the Chancellor, that was Hitler, and announced in the Reich Gazette. So it was a fait accompli, you just read about it, you didn't debate it. They shall take effect on the day following their promulgation, except where a different date is specified. And then a whole 10 articles of Constitution will not apply to statutes enacted by executive order. Article 4, this is the top of the page visible, treaties with foreign states which relate to matters of statute law shall not be subject to ratification by the legislative bodies. So you've got the deep state acting internationally with no checks and balances.
Alex, sorry, Alex, can I just say that sounds a bit similar to the Lancaster House treaties between Britain and France on defence.
Absolutely right, Mike. Absolutely right. The US actually, I gave them a criticism just now that they have executive orders, but they do have one thing up on us, which is that they have specific statute laws against the making of de facto diplomacy and treaties. They have bans on anyone who's not a diplomat doing that, not through the proper channels, which we don't. And so we have seen this happen in 2010, before and after the election of Cameron with the Franco-British Council. And then the article finishes that the executive shall issue the administrative law, which is an unlawful concept in common law. It's a French Napoleonic idea of the government setting its own law from time to time. The executive shall issue the administrative law requisite for the performance of of such treaties. So Deep State A and Deep State B fiddling and keeping up to date with each other without any parliamentary or public involvement. Article 5 says this law takes effect directly on the day of its promulgation. It shall elapse in 4 years' time, or if the present government is replaced by another. So that was the outcome of the Reichstag fire, the Enabling Act. I think people can see, now I've stripped away the Reich language from it, what's going on in English-speaking common law terms or subversion of common law terms. And here we have Hitler's speech, which you might like to read, Mike. This is the crucial passage of him introducing the Ermächtigungsgesetz and basically telling parliamentarians their services were no longer required.
So Hitler said that in order to enable the government to discharge its duties, which are within the general scope of this framework, the government has had the Enabling Act tabled in Parliament by the Nazi Party. Some of the intended measures require constitutional supermajority. The measures which are being introduced or suppressed here are necessary. It would be contrary to the spirit of national nobility and would not suffice the intended objective if the government were to have to barter and beg on a case-by-case basis for the measures it wished to take. In reaching this decision, the government is not motivated by the intent to abolish Parliament as such. On the contrary, the government is going to retain Parliament in future, educate Parliament from time to time on government measures, or will, for certain purposes when felt appropriate, obtain parliamentary approval. And this resulted in cries of bravo. And he went on, yet government authority and therefore the discharging of duties of government would suffer if doubt could be allowed to arise among the people as to the stability of the new regime. And again, cries of quite so. And then he went on to say, above all, the government regards any future sitting of Parliament, further sitting of Parliament to be impossible in the current situation of profound national crisis. Alex, the thing that struck me about this, and I mean, some people may view what we're suggesting here as being quite an extreme thing, but the people that would be accusing us of being extremist in presenting this in the way that we are, I would argue might be the same people that have been complaining in the last few months about the so-called Henry VIII powers and the fact that the Tory government is trying to take powers unto itself without parliamentary approval. And it seems to me that those two positions, that the position that by putting this forward that the UK column is extremist on one hand and them complaining about Henry VIII powers on the other, those two positions are untenable.
And something else is untenable, Mike, and that is accusing us of making comparisons between Hitler and Nazism and the British government, because the British government has beaten us to it by a good 48 hours by insinuating on all channels that the Russian administration is just like the Nazi government. That was 2 news cycles ago. And yesterday, Russian public broadcasters already came out with a package on the evening news pointing to the British elite and aristocratic endorsement of Nazism in the 1930s, which was later conveniently covered up. So there is already the proof out there that the like Hitler comparison has first been made in this by the authorities in a classic attempt of projection. People know Anthony Sutton's book, or they should do, his books on Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and another one called Wall Street and the Rise of Bolshevism. And there are interviews on YouTube to be found with him from the 70s and 80s, pointing out that the same financial interests and corporate interests that set up Hitler later transferred the techniques to particularly the US, but also Britain and Europe. So this idea of the bogeyman of anything you don't like being like Hitler is particularly wicked and intriguing, because it is a deliberate, Hitler was set up in a deliberate attempt to bring these measures into the West anyway.
Yeah. Alex, thank you for that brilliant analysis. Just before we move on to the propaganda side of what Theresa May is up to, what caught my mind in that speech was this gentle banter of government and Parliament. Well, Parliament, yes, should behave itself. The government is running the country, and of course the government is sort of very ill-defined. It's this deep power base that we can't really get to grips with. We think we've got elected members operating to help govern the country in Parliament, but in fact what we are now starting to see in UK is that is just a puppet show, and we've got these dark actors working in warm offices with closed doors elsewhere, part of the Privy Council, part of the Cabinet Office, where the state and the government is really taking place. This is unbelievably sinister stuff. And when we see Chatham House boasting of its ability to facilitate meetings behind closed doors where there's no minutes, common purpose involved, this is really what the deep state government is about.
Interesting that you mentioned dark actors, Brian. I know that you're, like me, an aficionado of Christopher Story, and the subtitle of his second most important book, easily found as a PDF, called The New Underworld Order. The subtitle of that book is Dark Actors Playing Games. And we see how it is that tyrannies can span communism, Nazism, and Western capitalism. It is at the level of the occultic, intriguing ideas that span these countries, particularly through the financiers and the secret organizations that they have. That is where the control lines are, and you can actually flip tyranny and hop it from one failing country or a country that's gone off reservation into another country. So very much so, I think. And the Cabinet Office, you're quite right to put your finger on. One of the smartest videos by S. Williamism, who I think has gone dormant now on YouTube and Twitter, is one in which he said that the law lords, and thereby the whole judicial pillar, the US equivalent would be the Supreme Court, the law lords' function was actually hived off from the judiciary and basically lodged with the executive a few years ago under Jack Straw, more than a decade ago now, or nearly a decade, through the same trick that you on paper you abolish the office and say there are no more lords, we have a Supreme Court now. But even the members of the judiciary who went to form that new Supreme Court said we're only a Supreme Court in name, the real functions still lodge with the Crown. But of course the Crown has been mediatized, and so those functions actually lodge in the Cabinet Office. So the executive is being the executive is also pretending to be the judiciary, and the executive is also playing at being the legislature.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's drill in a bit deeper. We'll come back to the same article, but move on with a different angle, because, of course, the headline was Britain to launch counter-propaganda war against Russia. So this is the real thing here. We've got a propaganda machine. The BBC is clearly the biggest propaganda machine in the world. There's no doubt about that. But here's Theresa May saying that she is starting a war against Russia, and she's going to use propaganda to do that. This is Barbarossa. She's now started it. She has started the war against Russia. She's using propaganda, but of course propaganda is capable of killing thousands, hundreds, thousands, millions of people if the propaganda is what foments the war. So I know you've got some other excerpts here from The Independent about disinformation being used by the government. I'll just bring the first on screen, and perhaps you could talk our viewers and listeners into this, and we can then move on to the other one.
There's no time to read the whole article, although the screenshots will help those who can't find it easily. It's from 1999, when NATO did the first of its illegal wars, in this case against what was still then called Yugoslavia, basically Serbia, against Serbia in order to get Kosovo. And it's by an Australian who died a couple of years ago, Philip Knightley, a very experienced journalist who wrote about the Anglo-American deep state in quite some detail and got a foreword to his book by John Pilger, whom people will probably know about. And he starts his story called Propaganda Wars on 26th of June 1999 in The Independent. He starts it off by saying there's been a long history of British press inventing, and of course they want a clear field to do it, which is why we're being suppressed now. The British press inventing hundreds of atrocity stories, starting with the Boer War, where Britain invented concentration camps together with the Germans in Namibia. And the atrocities involved Boers murdering British soldiers, Boer soldiers massacring pro-British civilians in South Africa, Boers executing other Boers who want to surrender, Boers attacking British Red Cross tents while brave British doctors and nurses were treating the wounded. Shades of Salisbury here, Brian, all the same drama. And Philip Knightley says they were all made up, spun out of the imagination of journalists and rendered more believable by artists back home, nowadays we have TV shows, who specialised in atrocity drawings. The attack on the Red Cross tent was even deemed worth filming, and when presented as genuine documentary footage, caused great outrage against the beastly Boers. It was actually shot with actors on Hampstead Heath, of all places. He then has a long section on the myth of German villainy in the First World War. There were some atrocities in Belgium. A Dutch journalist who was neutral in that war did describe that after the war, but nowhere near the extent or the nastiness that was described in British propaganda of the time. And through the middle section, particularly that right-hand column there, people can look at, it talks about a spurious association of Kosovo, and hence Milosevic, the big enemy of the time, with the Second World War. Okay, so in 1999, we have a senior Australian journalist already saying, when the British and Americans are in trouble, they say that the guy they're about to fight is like Hitler. This was 4 years, of course, before Saddam Hussein was called like Hitler and attacked for the second time. And ethnic cleansing, and the use of this term basically to mean a bad war, when all wars are in fact ethnic. And then towards the end, he talks about how the use of massacre accusations, which we're seeing again in the Skripal case, not quite a mass killing, but certainly a gruesome death, is pushed by the West-friendly people, in this case Albanians on the ground, quote, with the hint of the pornographer. The Albanian whispers, there's a massacre not far from here. And when no journalist is impressed, he adds urgently 20 bodies without heads. I suppose these days the urgent whisper is they've been poisoned with nasty neurotoxins, you see. And I just put an image in there of The First Casualty, which was Philip Knightley's really masterful on how truth is indeed the first casualty of war. This is a playbook that's 100 and 120 years old, Brian.
Yeah, and the picture is coming together very quickly. We're going to continue to run through with our analysis. We can tell today that people in our chat box are certainly picking up on what we're saying. There's astonishment. There are people saying this is very scary stuff. Well, for our UK viewers and listeners and viewers who are overseas, and we know there are a great many of those, you are now getting a real look at what is actually happening in UK today in 2018, and just what sort of government the Conservative government under Treason May is. But Holland is also pumping out the fake news, Alex.
To my astonishment, people can look at previous episodes to find out what Channel 6 fake news is. It's a Dutch government-funded youth enterprise to deliberately create fake news in a so-called attempt to make the viewer wiser. Well, I won't even read out those headlines at the top right. They're too disgusting, but these screenshots are of what the Channel 6 fake news people did. No doubt if they're challenged on these stories, they would say, well, those were the deliberate fake stories. But the element that binds them all is sexual, revolting content, really, to tell the youngest voters that there is no party worth voting for. You know, sexual innuendo, insinuation, gossip, rumour. The Dutch Interior Minister, who is a Bilderberger, by the way, Mrs. Ollongren, appeared with these hand-picked 15 media students to say, to try to spot the real from the fake in stories about herself, and really trivializing the whole issue with a smirk on her face because her ministry has been funding all this. But to my astonishment, we just had the municipal elections in the Netherlands and a referendum on whether or not to have an enabling act over here on giving the security services carte blanche to do what they want with our data. And in a narrow 48 to 46% margin with a few spoiled votes, the Dutch people have said they do not want this intelligence law. But it's an advisory referendum only, and none other than the Interior Minister herself, Mrs. Ollongren, has recently said that there will be no more referenda after this because she's just abolished the referendum law.
Right. So that is a classic example in my mind of this government versus parliament. The government says, well, we'll give you a little referendum and you can play at that, but if we don't like what you say, the government will do it anyway. We don't really care what your elected representatives say. Let's move on through with having a look at how news is formed. This one caught my eye yesterday. Mapped, this is the Daily Star, mapped Russia's nuke targets in Britain. Is your town safe? Well, I can tell everybody with great confidence that, of course, Plymouth has not been safe for many years because of the naval base here. But there we go. So what did I notice? Well, I noticed on this embedded video, it brought up PBS. I didn't know what that was, so I went to have a look at it, and I find it's a sort of media, sort of news service. So I did what I always do, is to have a look at money if I can find it, but also the people. And in this case, up came this lady. And what is interesting about her is her background. Her name is Bishlos, is founder and CEO of Rock Creek, a global investment and advisory firm. Previously, she was managing director and partner of the Carlyle Group. Prior to that, she was Treasurer and Chief Investment Officer of the World Bank. So we've got people who are right at the top of the power tree with big money, but also the military industrial complex, the Carlyle Group. And surprise, surprise, they are now formulating media video clips, which of course are complete propaganda to brand the Russians. And here it is appearing in the Star. So people need to be very careful about who is really producing what is supposedly the true news. Where can we go from that? Well, let's come back on to Carol Cadwallader. We mentioned her yesterday, and we said that she was talking about the Cambridge Analytica case. And the bit that really caught my eye at the time was that she said that the SCL, Cambridge Analytica, was not some startup created by a couple of guys with an Apple Mac computer. It's effectively part of the British defence establishment and now to the American defence establishment. So we've got billionaires coupled with the UK's Ministry of Defence and the defence establishment conducting psychological warfare on the UK public. Now, this journalist, for her credit, was able to see this. She's putting parts of the picture together. But what she can't quite understand is this business that it is this deep state government that is running the country, not those silly little politicians in Westminster. But maybe we can continue to help push her along, because at least she's coming out with some good material. What many people have forgotten, but I'm going to say UK column hasn't, that in March 2014, out of nowhere, we had Francis Maude announcing that the UK government had formed a partnership with our intelligence services and Israel. I found this quite astonishing at the time, because it didn't only link in organisations like GCHQ directly with the Israeli Defence Force Unit 8200, one of their intelligence organisations, but it also linked together universities, it linked together British police. No discussion in Parliament, simply announcement by the deep state government. I want to move on very quickly, Alex, but just give you the opportunity to respond on that one, because of course you've been very close to some of these areas.
In my day, it was an absolute no-no to mention to anyone political, even if they were cleared to top secret, that we had a signals intelligence relationship with 8200. But the government itself has blown the gaff on that, which is rather surprising. Yeah.
Rather surprising. Nevertheless, it is still there in place in the background, except that Treason May's government doesn't talk about it. Well, let's have a look at what Russia Today says, if we're still allowed to do that. Just an astonishing headline: UK government needed a good spy scandal after the Brexit fallout. And I think the Russians are on the money here, Mike, because they've had a look at what's been going on. Of course, absolute mayhem as a result of the 17 million people saying we want nothing to do with the European Union. And it's taken the Russia Today to bring this to the fore. Let's have a look at this quote from Vladimir Chitsov, the Russian permanent representative to the EU. He said, the scandal, so he's talking about the Skripal scandal, the scandal has a feel of being orchestrated from the beginning. It all started with the British government blaming Russia for the tragic incident, not only before the investigation was completed, but before it even started. Scotland Yard itself said it would take weeks, and the OPCW said it might take months to reach a conclusion. But I have the impression that the British government never wanted a conclusion, that it had its own decision ready well in advance. And I think, Mike, once again, that man's spot on, because we're now seeing with Fusion exactly what the Conservative government had prepared in the background. And have a look at the comments here from Rodney Atkinson, a very experienced, renowned blogger and writer. And his comments, I think, very, very interesting indeed. He talks about the political obscenity of the week is Boris Johnson's disgraceful attempt to compare Vladimir Putin's World Cup with Adolf Hitler's Olympics. He goes on to talk about the suffering of the Russian people and indeed Putin's own family. He talks about 20 million deaths, Russian deaths in the Second World War. And he then gets really stuck in because he said here, if anyone can be compared with Nazi Germany, it's NATO and the EU, who funded the overthrow of a democratically elected Ukrainian government, helped to organise a Russia-phobia extreme nationalist movement, which has so far led to the deaths of 10,000 Russian-speaking Ukrainians and Russians in East Ukraine, and which has destroyed the democratic constitutions of countries freed from the Soviet Empire. NATO and the EU have stood by or actively encouraged fascist movements in Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo and Ukraine, where Nazi and fascist Second World War insignia, flags and torchlit marches now feature within the EU and its neighbourhood protectorates. So Alex, absolutely no messing there from Rodney Atkinson, and I think that view, the depth of strength of that view is now beginning to move across this country as people recognise this Conservative government for what it really is.
And I would add to Mr. Atkinson's list Georgia, which was the first of these Sorosite, effectively fascist coups in 2003 in the Georgian case. But as we recently reported, the Georgians are so sick of it, they're calling for the abolition of the whole lot, right back to the flag that was brought in 2003, which has got a kind of crusader feel to it. So there is hope, I think. As regards Eastern Ukraine, Rodney Atkinson never tires of talking about that absolute atrocity. There has been reporting this month in Russian sources, admittedly from the People's Republic of Donetsk, so that, of course, an independent statelet from Ukraine, although I have to stress they do not want to be absorbed by Russia. They have their own independent desires. There has been reporting from the town of Severodonetsk out there that a primary school was turned into a brothel visited by Ukrainian troops, and that this was done allegedly under the noses of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, which patrol these war zones right down to Armenia. And apparently, after being rumbled, that same building has been turned into a so-called university under the control of the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, now that the Ukrainian troops have recaptured the area, where people are going to be trained in New Think and EU globalism. So it's a very, very dark picture, and yet again we see the child abuse factor as the glue and the fuel in it all.
Okay, well, let's move on to another level. We're still on the same story, what the Tories are doing to this country. Here's a celebration taking place in Plymouth because HMS Ocean is being decommissioned prior to going to Brazil. Of course, the amphibious carrier has been sold off. Here's the Navy clearly celebrating, and with an air of cynicism, I'll say I don't know whether the padre, as he'd be called, the vicar in the middle of the picture, was one of those who approved Satanism for use on board Royal Navy warships. Perhaps he was, perhaps he wasn't. Here's the Queen. She's come down. This is a very important occasion. We're getting rid of a warship, so naturally she wants to be there. This is the same lady I met on board a warship for one of her formal birthday occasions. I was able to shake the royal gloved hand, and she told me that one of the reasons she was enjoying the evening was that she was among friends, to which I say, well, an extraordinary way to treat your friends by the fact you support the government as it destroys Britain's military. This was the headline: our national security is at stake. Now HMS Ocean has been axed. This headline by the Herald Mike is as if they don't really understand how this has happened. All of a sudden the ship has been axed and they're all a bit confused as to how this has happened. So let's have a look at the crass responses by local Conservative representatives. Here is Mr. Streeter. Remember, this is the man that attacked me personally when I asked questions about the destruction of the Royal Navy. He said, we want to increase the Royal Navy, not decrease it. But Ocean is a relatively old vessel. We have 2 new aircraft carriers coming into service and a fleet of new frigates about to be built. We do need modern ships with modern capabilities. Of course, the battle to keep our 2 other amphibious ships, Albion and Bulwark, continues, and I'm fully behind that. So the Russians are coming, Mike, and what his party is doing with his support and knowledge is to absolutely cut the British military to the bone. Somebody is lying somewhere. Let's bring in Labour, because of course this is a cross-party collaboration. And here's Luke Pollard. The loss of HMS Ocean marks a sad day for Devonport. A few years ago, the Queen was in Plymouth when she recommissioned HMS Ocean back into the Royal Navy after a £64 million refit. Only 4 years later, she's back to decommission the flagship of our fleet as Ocean is sold to Brazil in the latest round of Tory defence cuts. This is a sad day for Devonport as we lose our largest Devonport-based warship, and with it 1/3 of our nation's amphibious assault ships. So the Russians are coming, but we're going to get rid of 1/3 of our amphibious ships. This is complete nonsense, of course. We believe, and I have to say we believe that in his former days, Luke Pollard did a little bit of research for the EU, as it were, into defence. Did this man know about EU military unification, which required British forces to be cut? My guess is he did. That's my personal
difficult
guess.
to imagine any other option, isn't it?
Yes, but it doesn't matter what party, the same spin is put on the whole thing. Let's bring in Johnny Mercer. What a lad this boy is. It's a sad day whenever we see a ship that has provided the brilliant service Ocean has leaving the service, but I'm looking forward to the Defence Modernisation Programme coming out and illuminating a very positive and growing vision for the Royal Marines and the Royal Navy. The departure of Ocean does not leave a hole in our capability. Clearly, we would be better off with it, but there are other ships that can perform the role. This man, I'm going to say with great respect to others, this man, well, I think he's better just staying with his rifle in a trench. And I don't mean that with any disrespect to soldiers who may be listening to the programme, but this man is not a huge intellect. Let's do one more and we'll finish this nonsense. Tom Watson, Labour, has also been in Plymouth. The government held a brief defence review that was before the rise of Putin, Russia's annexing of the Crimea and their patrolling the space next to UK borders. We have the growth in piracy and the increased requirement for providing disaster relief because of climate change. We have the Russians coming half an hour away from the Moray Firth and the Royal Navy having to dispatch a ship from the south coast half a day away to look at that. And what we're going to do, we're going to cut the Navy. This, Mike, this is madness coming out of these people's mouths, or it's propaganda. This is not accidental.
Well, I'm glad to see, Brian, you were completely balanced in that report because you had 2 from the Tories and 2 for Labour, so that was balanced. Ofcom can't come at us today.
Okay, well, that's good.
Tomorrow maybe.
Do these people know what's going on? Do they know the plan is that Britain's military is cut and cut and cut in order to make sure it's fully locked into that EU unified structure? I believe they do. If they don't know that, then they are ignorant, they're fools, and they don't understand what the government is doing as opposed to their party political masters. But the good news is, Mike, that Treason May is not only protecting us against the Russian hordes, she's also going to protect us from sickness and ill health. So let's have a look at what she's doing. The Russians are coming, quick, break up the NHS. Here's the headline. A massive shake-up of NHS funding in a bid to solve the cash crisis. So this has all got method. You can understand it. It's visible, not. I'm unveiling a massive shake-up of NHS funding this year. It will involve a multi-year settlement for hospitals. You happy with that, Mike? You understand what that is? A multi-year settlement. And of course, it won't involve any more cash. I've put that in because the paper itself says, well, she's announced this, but it's not clear whether the NHS is going to get any more money. And what is she suggesting? Well, she says, I would suggest that we can't afford to wait until next Easter. I think this is a real marker. They want the NHS broken up. She's now warning that they've got to do it as soon as possible. So we've got the problem of the Russians, but we're going to work by breaking up the NHS as well. This is Superwoman. Don't forget, we told you yesterday that she's looking at an extra tax to pay for a breakup of the NHS. And at this point, we'll say, you do need to come to our NHS health conference, Dying for Good Health, on May the 12th at the Albert Hall, Nottingham. There's the box. You can click on the UK column for details. We've excellent speakers. These are new speakers, with the exception of two, Graham Downing and Patrick Quantum.
New to our audience.
New to our audience, thank you, Mike. This will be a very special event, and the timing is special. And I'm going to say also tonight in the Lugger Hotel in Penzance, there's a talk, Healthy Detachment, and that starts at 19:30. So if you can get there, please do. Before I have one slide to end on, Alex, just give you the opportunity to come in there. It is just extraordinary how the government thinks that it can have the population believe we're all going to be murdered in our beds by Russians. That's if any of us are left after the Islamic hordes have got to us. And they are going to defend us by absolutely slaughtering the British military. Somebody is lying, and I think the lies are coming out of that deep state government.
Our military is being cut so that we can have a pan-European militarized gendarmerie. Our police are being retrained so that instead of patrolling and preventing crime, they are social workers focusing on our vulnerabilities and our speech and thought. And I would almost be inclined to say that we'd welcome, in this case, a Russian marine invasion of Plymouth. Of course, shouldn't be taken seriously, or will be accused of succouring the enemy. And I say that because while we've been on air, the Plymouth Herald, no less, has reported that a dozen Plymouth schools have been affected by this wave of hoax, even threatening pupils' safety, and schools are on lockdown. But there's no troops and ratings left in Plymouth to deal with it, much less police resources. So schools are just having to deal with it themselves. It would almost be more convenient to hand Devonport over to the Russians at this point and have some Spetsnaz stationed there.
Well, I don't know what to say, Alex. We've often said it, trying to report the news now is becoming increasingly difficult because it is so bizarre, it's so childish, it's so cartoon-like. But Plymouth wins the biscuit, because let's have a look at this. This is an article embedded in the Plymouth Herald. I'll give you the meat of it in 2 seconds, but here's Teresa. I don't know whether these are minders or not. They look a little bit scruffy. Almost looks like the Islamic State has got to her. Probably I'll be got for that comment. Theresa May reaffirms the belief that Russia is responsible for spy poisoning. Theresa May reaffirms the belief.
Yes.
Does that mean to say that they haven't yet got the evidence that it's the Russians, Mike?
Absolutely.
Oh, so it's a belief that the Russians is responsible, and she's using that for Operation Barbarossa. But ready for this headline? Here it is. Plymouth has just severed all ties with Russia. So, Alex, we may have lockdown in the Plymouth schools, but at least the chiefs, as the article describes, in Plymouth City Council have said we are not having anything to do with those nasty Russians. And this is embarrassing because, of course, the UK column offices are very close to the end of the road named the Novorossiysk Road. So I don't know, as we've said before, whether the council is going to be digging those road signs up. This is pantomime. I just really can't say any more, but serious stuff. Closing remarks, 20 seconds, please.
It's bitterly ironic because, even in America now, people are not generally aware of the Pilgrim Fathers or of the naval history, Sir Francis Drake of Plymouth, because of the retooling of the education system. But Russia, great admiration for the British Navy and for the Pilgrim Fathers. And if you say Plymouth to almost anyone in Russia, they will tell you more about Plymouth history than most Brits or Americans could these days.
That's certainly true. We should also remember, of course, that it was shipwrights from Devonport Dockyard in Plymouth that went across to help the Russians build their main naval fleets. So very interesting. It should be Plymouth that cynically says we're cutting off relations based on Theresa May's belief. We better end there. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.